Hello lovely people, how are you all doing today? I hope you're well. I am, sun's shining, I'm happy, yay! Books, yes. I've got quite an interesting, that darned car alarm. Let's try and ignore it. I've got a really interesting little collection for you today. All sorts, non-fiction, some poetry, a picture book. It's a really eclectic collection today. So let's dive straight in with the first one today, which is Mark Kurlansky's Cod. This is actually published in 1999. It's 25 years old. And I've mentioned this in a couple of previous videos about how this book used to always turn up in my bookshop. I mean, literally almost on a weekly basis, I would say. This book was massive in the noughties. And there were so many times I picked it up and I thought, nah, cod, why do I want to read a book about cod? I'm vegetarian. But then it came up in conversation recently in comments, and then I saw it. And it was a quid in a shop. I thought, I'm having it, let's do it. And I'm so glad I did, because, wow, what an interesting and thought-provoking book. So yes, it's about the fish, cod, but essentially it's all about humans going after this fish for eating, and the whole industry that's come out of that, of the fishing industry. It's a really far-ranging book. We start back in sort of like the 10th century. Just to say very quickly as well, when I was a kid in the 70s, little kid, I do remember this thing called the Cod Wars, and I just didn't understand it. Why were we fighting over cod? But that's kind of at the heart of this book. The best fishing grounds, and now a siren, it's going to be one of those days. It's these sort of fights over the best fishing grounds, whether it's the North Sea or on the other side of the pond, down the eastern coast of Canada and the northernmost parts of the USA. This guy's American who wrote it, so it is a slightly US-centric. But in a way, it's a history of sort of European exploration, as much as it is about the history of fishing, and how the European nations, Portugal, Spain, France, the UK, were all pushing to explore the New World. I'm not even going to go into the fact that it was already inhabited. Let's just put that to one side for now. Also, the race to find a western passage to China. Explorers were convinced there must be a way to China going west, as in going across the Atlantic rather than going east. Of course, we now know there wasn't one until the Panama Canal. So yeah, it's social history, it's economic history, the scrapping between the countries. There's a huge part of it is, of course, the development of Canada and USA. People laying claim, countries, nations laying claim to these bits of land, and of course they wanted to lay claims to the bits of land because then they could lay claims to the bits of sea. I had no idea, for instance, one thing I had no idea about, I know of the place called Cape Cod in Massachusetts, because my sister went there for 2 summers when she was at university her only time round, when she was 19, 20. She went to Cape Cod to teach at one of the summer camps there, quite posh summer camp. So she went to teach tennis and sailing. So I knew of Cape Cod, but I'd never thought, cod as in cod the fish. So it was fascinating reading about sort of the development of Boston and why Boston ended up being such a rich city. It's all because of this fish. So, from the history of the development of those North American territories at that stage, but also just all the infighting with the European countries. France and England, we've always butted heads, haven't we? Really interesting, really good. Also touched on the history of frozen food, Bird's Eye, Mr. Bird's Eye. Ultimately, though, I was just looking at my notes, this is what I wanted to refer to. Ultimately, it comes right up to the modern era. And throughout, there's a thread of, there have been times throughout history when nations have said, hang on a minute, we've got to slow down. So initially the catches were massive, sort of going back to the 15th, 16th centuries, 17th century even, the catches were massive. But then by the 18th and certainly into the 19th century, voices were being raised, concerned voices, to say, hang on a minute, are we overfishing? Maybe we need to leave this patch of sea fallow for a while. There was a misconception that because a cod lays so many eggs, I think up to 1 million eggs, that, these fish will be abundant forever and ever and ever, little realising that of those 1 million eggs that are laid, I think it was 1 million, possibly only 2 survived to adulthood. Staggering numbers. So there is that thread throughout the book, and then by the end, those questions become more and more prominent about, should all the nations, the North Atlantic nations, should we all have a moratorium for a while to let these creatures, restock themselves? Do we need to give up fishing for a generation? What did I write? Yeah, do we need to give up fishing for a whole generation? Should fishing as an industry be so heavily subsidised? If fishing isn't paying, should we subsidise it, or should we say, actually, we need a moratorium on this for a whole generation, maybe? Difficult questions, and I'm not saying any of that should happen, but can we go on as we have been if there are so few fish left? And then you say, but what about people's livelihood? Of course, it's a huge issue, and I don't pretend to have any answers. And fishing is one of those sort of ancient jobs, traditions, so many communities. We think of, say, Cornwall or Grimsby in the northeast, where whole towns are built around the culture of fishing. So if we lose that as an industry, what happens to those towns? Difficult questions. And it also raises the question of, if we deplete these fishing stocks completely, is it the end for us as humans eating from the wild? Because, most of the rest of what we eat, the vast majority of what we eat is farmed, whether it's animal products or plant products. The vast majority of what all of us eat is farmed. Very little of our food comes from the wild. So like I said, it raises some difficult questions. Also, I should just point out, for any of you who fancy it, fascinating work. Amazingly, I couldn't put it down. I just wanted to keep reading. Brilliant. There are parts of the history of fishing which are really, really unpleasant, because of course, we're dealing with a period where, slavery was at its height in the Caribbean, and there is a triangle. There is a sort of a trade. I don't know what word to use, because when we're dealing with human beings, how can you call it trade? But there is that sort of triangle of fishing, taking slaves from Africa, or I need to do it in the other direction, reverse for the image, taking humans from Africa to the Caribbean, taking that sugar up north to trade, and using the rubbish fish, the fish that wasn't good enough to come back to Europe, was then used as cheap fodder for slaves. So that's a really difficult part of the book. I mean, it's just impossible to stomach that, isn't it? But it's part of that history, and we can't read history with rose-tinted spectacles. We just hope, we learn from it. But I would say overall, absolutely fascinating book. I was amazed at just how fascinated and deeply engrossed I became in it. And like I said, I didn't want to put it down. I am really late to this party though, 25 years on. I'm sure a load of you will have read it already, but if you haven't, grab a copy. Your library really ought to have a copy. It says, the subtitle of the book is A Biography of the Fish That Changed the World. Boy, oh boy, didn't it just. So yeah, highly recommend Mark Kurlansky's Cod. There was one little bit that annoyed me, and it was a linguistic thing. I've just got to tell you, because I was like, stop saying that. And then I kind of got used to it. But if I was to describe, for example, let's say I was talking about the Isle of Wight, I would say it's an island off the south coast of the UK. What I wouldn't say is it's an island off of the south coast. This guy just kept saying off of. So he's talking about the waters off of Newfoundland, the waters off of Maine, the waters off of the Northern England, the waters off of. And it's like, stop saying off of, just say off. Anyway, semantics, little tiny thing. Loved it, couldn't put it down. Give it a go. Now, a slight change of tack. So, just grabbing my notes out. I bought this book just into the new year. Lucy Jones, Losing Eden, Why Our Minds Need the Wild. So you can, like, just from that alone, you think, oh, that's why Vivi picked it up. What have I marked here? I didn't mark anything in the Cod book because I was just racing through it. In a nutshell, well, she starts off with one question, but it sort of becomes another. But this is all about, are we as humans becoming disconnected from nature? The more that technology advances, the more time we spend indoors, the more parks that are grubbed up and turned into car parks or shopping malls, whatever it is, the more we lose nature and we become disconnected. Is that having a detrimental effect on our health, specifically our mental health? Will we come to a point in the future where there is no nature anymore, but we have green spaces which are, say, astroturf, plastic grass, plastic trees? Will it matter? Do we actually need it? And then so that's her sort of starting point question of, are we becoming disconnected from nature? And if we are, is that going to have a detrimental effect on us? But the flip side of that is, does nature have a positive effect on us, on our mental health? I mean, even so before I even started reading it, I was thinking, well, of course nature has a positive effect on us. I can put my hand up and say, I'm the perfect example of it. I know just how much I get from nature and how good it makes me feel. I know that there's bacteria in soil, that when I've got my hands in the soil, that bacteria gets into my system and releases, I can't remember whether it's endorphins or dopamine, it's one or the other. So I come from a starting point of already having made my mind up. but it's interesting to read all the same. Now, it's obviously a really thoroughly researched book. The book itself is only about 200 pages long, but then there's a section that's nearly 50 pages long, which are all the notes. So as you're reading, she'll say, there was a study conducted in 1982, and there'll be a little number, and it's a reference to the notes section at the back. So there are, to give you an example, so all these different studies are cited. So if you wanted to do any further reading, all the original source material is included, so you can go and do loads more reading. And that, in a way, tells you quite a bit about the book. It's, on the one hand, it feels a bit academic, and I think if I was writing a paper for, my MA or my doctorate, and I was, let's see now, if it was still my nursing days, paediatric nursing, if I was writing a paper, do children recover more quickly after surgery if they have contact with nature? This book would be a great source book because it's got that massive reference at the back. But honestly, it became, for me, it was a bit dry. It isn't an academic book. She's not an academic. But even so, it became a bit dry for my taste and somewhat repetitive. And ultimately, I think it's because, like I said, because I started from the point of thinking, well, yeah, I know nature has a good effect on us. Surely we all know that by now. So in a way, it was sort of like, well, I know the answer already. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there about genetics that have a sort of evolutionary genetics of our brains. For instance, why we are attracted to trees, why we love trees. And if we go right back to the beginning of being human, a tree was important because it meant shelter underneath it. It meant shelter in terms of get up into the tree to escape something on the ground, get up into the tree to have a vantage point to see further distances. So trees, to our primeval ancestors, were really, really important. So perhaps there's a link that those evolutionary genetics are still in us. So that was really interesting. I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. But otherwise, I'm just going to have a quick look at my notes. Yeah, I've sort of summed it up really. That's evolutionary needs in our, that's what I meant, not genetics, in our DNA, well, DNA genetics. Yeah. I didn't finish it. It's not often I don't finish a book. Like I said, it's about 200 pages. I read about 110, 115 pages. And honestly, I got a bit bored. Yeah, I got bored, which is surprising because as a subject, it's right up my street. I think it was her writing style. I'm not sure. I can't put my finger on it, but I just thought, yeah, you've said that already, or it just didn't pull me in. It didn't engage me. I know the points she's trying to make. They're things that I've already thought for myself. So apart from that kind of primeval evolutionary DNA thing, there was nothing really new or surprising in there for me. And yeah, I just got bored of it. Sorry, Lucy Jones. The quote from the Times says, "A hymn to the healing power of nature." But like I said, don't we all know that already? Any of us who've ever put our hands into soil or hugged a tree or lain on our backs in a wildflower meadow just gazing at blue sky, listening to skylarks. Yeah, we're there already, aren't we? Now for something completely different. Back to one of my Christmas presents. This was from Patricia. I'm really sorry to all my Polish friends. I still haven't learnt how to pronounce her name. Wislawa Szymborska. Wislawa Szymborska. Won the Nobel Prize in 1996, the Nobel Prize for Literature, Polish poet. This is a collection of, as it says, poems new and collected, 1957 to 1997. I used to read a lot of poetry, less so recently. Actually, the other day I was listening to some John Betjeman. Oh, lovely John Betjeman. So simple, so lovely. Because I think it's the anniversary of his birth or death. I can't remember which. Anyway, used to read lots, haven't so much in recent years. And in terms of critiquing poetry, that's a little bit out of my comfort zone. I always feel like I love and appreciate poetry, but I'm not brainy or articulate enough to talk about it. However, I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes on this because since Christmas, I've dipped in sort of in the middle, towards the end, the beginning, and then I decided, actually, I think I want to start right at the beginning and read it in sort of chronological order to see if I get a sense of her development as a poet, her development as a person. What I will say of I think I've probably read about sort of 10 or 12 of the poems. There's one called The Garden. I went straight to that one. Was there one called, I can't remember if there's one called The Sister or something, but I read it and it made me think of my sister. Anyway, what I will say is I found all the poems that I've read so far really easy and accessible. And I think that's one thing that puts people off poetry, isn't it? That they can be a bit sort of like, ooh, this is a bit weird and highfalutin and I don't really understand what it means and am I supposed to understand it? And, ooh, you know, you have to be really brainy to understand poems. These are so straightforward and accessible and there's a sort of an immediate connection. They are not difficult to understand. But I think, like with any poetry, I think it's a case of read a poem and let it sit with you for a minute and let it go around, then maybe read it again. But hers are, I would say, very immediate and very accessible. So I'm really, really loving it. Thank you, Patricia. But now I'm going to read it from the start to see if that changes, you know, how I see her. I wanted to read you one, but I think I can't because of copyright. Anyway, if you ever come across her in the library, if you haven't read poetry for ages and you think, yeah, let's read something, let's give something a go, Wislawa Szymborska, good stuff. Then finally today, it's going to be a real quickie today. That's what happens when you don't finish a book. And when I talk about poetry, because I don't know how to talk about poetry. Every now and again. So I read the cod, loved it, galloped through it. Probably read it in a couple of sittings. Then I moved on to Losing Eden, the Lucy Jones, Losing Eden. And I had that on the go for a week, and that tells me everything. I'd read 10 pages or so and then I'd put it down and you know what it boils down to as well, I'd put it down and I'd think, I just felt a bit flat, and that's when I know, hang on, this book isn't working for me, and life's just too darn short, isn't it? So I decided that's it, give up on it. And I went to my stack of, next to read books. I've got that lovely, I've got a couple of gift books actually, including Long Road and the one I have now started. But anyway, after I'd put that one down, I just didn't know what I wanted to read. I didn't know what I fancied. I was looking at my unread books and nothing really immediately grabbed me. that happens sometimes. I'm sure you get it too. I'm sure those of you who are like me, you're kind of normally you're back-to-back reading, and as much as you're enjoying the book that you're currently in, sometimes you can't wait to finish it because you want to start that next book, and you know. But every now and again, you just have that moment of, I don't know what I want. It's like food, isn't it? Sometimes you go, I just don't know what I fancy eating tonight. And, you know, I love hummus and toasted pita, but I don't even fancy that tonight. I don't even fancy chocolate. I just don't know. So I had that moment. So when that happens, I just give myself a little bit of a break, a bit of space. I can't be without a book, but it's not about reading a book. So I turn to one of my picture books. So one of my, sort of, you can't really see, these sort of larger format books down here, my art books, and there's some Arctic and Antarctic stuff and mountaineering stuff down here. Yeah. More of that another day. But the one I picked up instead on this occasion is this gorgeous book, Classic Printed Textiles from France, 1760 to 1843. It's Toiles de Jouy. And it's gorgeous. It's simply a book of Toiles de Jouy patterns from that late 18th century through to the 19th century. There is some text, there's some history. But this is the sort of thing that, yeah, I mean, you see, there is some text and some history. It's the sort of thing that is just a joy, Toiles de Jouy, joy, to just dip into from time to time. I've had this book probably about 20 years, and I often just pull it off the shelf for, like all these larger format books of mine. I've got quite a collection on fabric, historical fabrics, fabric from history. I love them because it's almost like a palate cleanser after some difficult books, or like the card, like I said with the card, there's that difficult stuff all to do with slavery. It's horrible to read. And then the Losing Eden, that's a difficult book because just it didn't do it for me or whatever. So yeah, it's almost like a palate cleanser. I can just curl up on the sofa and lose myself and get inspired as well. Just the visual aspect, just soaking up pattern, colour, form, gets my creative juices flowing as well. But more than anything, it just acts as that little bit of a break when I want something for that kind of midnight hour when I finish doing my day and it's not quite time to sleep. I need something, but it's just gentle and easy. Just gentle and easy. See, even adults need a picture book from time to time. Love it. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed having my little dip through that once again. Like I say, it gets my creative mind racing as well. I don't really have time at the moment to be doing any sewing, but it's made me want to do some sewing just so I can paint with fabric again. Oh, joy. But yes, that's great. And it was just enough sort of space, kind of clearing a bit of brain space as well, for me to now launch into getting back to some reading. So I've started my next book, which I'll bring you obviously at some point in a couple of weeks or so. I won't say anything about it yet. It was a gift. I don't know what to make of it. I wasn't quite sure. It just turned up out of the blue. Not the sort of thing I would normally choose at all. So let's see how that goes. It's always interesting, isn't it, to read something out of one's comfort zone. And yeah, it's like I said with the poetry. Sometimes, yeah, let's just nudge ourselves sideways out of our comfort zone. Try something else, because who knows? You might find something that you really love that you may have thought for years. You may have had a prejudice, thought, like me with with the classic crime fiction that my sister got me started on, I would have always gone, oh, poo-poo. But I really love it. It's like, yeah, that's a real mind blur when I read the crime. But it's fun. All right, lovelies, I will see you all again really soon. I'm particularly, for myself, I'm interested to know how I'm going to respond to this book that was a gift, which, yeah, I would, like I said, I would never have picked for myself. So I'm looking forward to getting properly stuck in and bringing that to you in the not too distant future. Until then, happy reading and happy maybe exploring outside of your normal genre. You never know. Not sci-fi though, not for me. All right, lovelies, until the next one, cheerio.